So I'm joined here by Masha Vlasova, and she's an experimental and documentary filmmaker born in Russia before emigrating to the USA as a preteen. She has exhibited her films all across the US, with her film Un-Tidal having its European premiere at EFEA in May as part of our Best Celluloid category. She has described Un-Tidal as an experimental film essay about a found/stolen photograph, a hurricane, and film's inherent ability to animate and reanimate still, dead, and inanimate beings, images, and objects. The film is created using an inkjet direct-on-film technique where the digital frame is printed directly onto recycled 16mm celluloid. She'll be screening a short film titled Her Type in 2019, from 2019 at Current New Media Film Festival that will take place in mid-June 2022 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, USA. She's also going to participate in an artist residency at Artles Creative Center in Hämeenkyrö, Finland during the month of June 2022. You can view all of her works at mashavlasova.com. We'll put a link in the description, and they're well worth checking out. Right. Hello.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Right. So I'm going to start with, I guess, the seed actually for the idea of Un-Tidal, kind of where it began and how it took form ultimately.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I had the text written a while ago, like several years ago. The film kind of uses Hurricane Sandy, which hit New York City in 2012, as this kind of narrative turning point. And I wrote the text, I think, in 2014. But the text itself was a kind of elaboration of an earlier idea, just thinking about like happening upon an object that's really charged. And that's what artists do sometimes. We sometimes happen upon an image or a text or an object. And there's so many things, there's so many ways that an artist can interpret it, especially a conceptual artist, or reframe it, so to speak. And yeah, and I was thinking about what it might mean to meditate on not being able to pursue any of those reframing possibilities. So I wrote the text a while ago, and I was genuinely fascinated by this photograph and wanted to reanimate it. And I just couldn't really find, I wanted to give it movement, I guess. And in 2014, when I wrote the text, I was experimenting in the darkroom by like printing negatives, like contact printing negatives frame by frame, which created a kind of like jittery animation. And I really liked it, but it wasn't really a film yet. And I just had to kind of sit on this text for a while, and things that I tried with it, they didn't work. I showed them, I got some feedback, I didn't like it. And then I think about a year ago, I was very lucky to meet a filmmaker, a US filmmaker, Carissa Hahn, who makes inkjet 60mm pieces. She's very, very talented. And she held a little workshop, and I attended it, not really expecting much. And I was just really curious, and I was a fan of her work. But I found the image quality that's produced by this process to be very beautiful, but also conceptually like really aligned with the film. It gives it, it animates it, it gives it movement, but also it's such like an office-based process. And so much of the idea behind the film is being at an office and being in this monotonous kind of like boring job, and then being struck by this image. Like the image kind of like emerges out of this tedium. So to use a process that is kind of native to the office, and the image is native to this office environment, it just kind of like, I was like, okay, this is the text. Now I know how to give it life. So that's how it came together. And there's a lot of dead time in between, I guess, between the text and the image, and finally printing and learning this process, or following the process that Carissa Hahn developed. And yeah, and that's kind of a really long
No,
story.
that's perfect. No, that's I guess, yeah, for anyone, hopefully we'll have some kind of imagery on screen. It's kind of, I almost liken it to kind of bacteria almost. There's this really kind of organic feeling to it, and you can kind of simultaneously see the process on display, as in you kind of, you know what's happening, but it's so kind of ethereal and just disconnected from it almost. And it really is, it's like inherently hypnotic, and it's very fascinating. And I kind of, sound, I guess, is probably the next component that was really important. Obviously there's the narration, that I love the way it cuts out. I think the end of the narration is really, really cool. And I just, yeah, you've got the kind of office noises and stuff. Was that also as organic of a process, or was it a little different?
Yeah, I think once I found this process and started experimenting with it, and it made sense to make this film, yeah, everything sort of just started coming together very quickly. And once before collaborated with this wonderful actor, Devron Reddy, who is, I think, based in North Carolina right now. And he's working on his own film right now, so check him out. He's great. And he did a voiceover for another kind of less experimental, more traditional film for me last year. And I was really on the fence about whether there should be a masculine voice or a more feminine voice, and does it matter? And in the end, I wanted a little more of that kind of mediation and distance, and I chose his voice, which I really love the way he reads. And the other sounds, yeah, that just came together through the editing process. What I really like about printing directly on film is, and I'll show you, this is like something I didn't scan. I'm using Carissa Hahn's template here, but it's an object, and what's so nice about it is I could just pin these up on my wall behind me and kind of see them as objects and move them around. And that was kind of liberating. I don't usually edit like this. Obviously, I edit on the computer. So to have this kind of like tactile and like visual way of thinking about time and duration and sequence was very, very liberating. And I think that opened up some space for sound, where I could kind of like experiment a bit more. And a lot of the sounds I recorded myself, and then a lot of the sounds kind of came through the interwebs. There are images that I'm using from YouTube of Hurricane Sandy. And again, it made sense to have those be found images, because the image at the center of the piece is a found image. So so that the kind of mediation of the internet, or like taking this digital image and turning it into this filmic image, but through the digital process, it kind of made sense that it all lives in this space that's both accessible to me and is not quite mine. Is not like original to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, it's amazing. I'm intrigued about, because I've got the analog cookbook here, and I know in there it mentions, I don't know if that's this filmmaker you're mentioning, but I remember reading about the inkjet printing. It's something I was looking at. There's another thing I found there's a guy, it's called 16mm.com, and he teaches you how to print your own 16mm film out of anything, laser cutting. And it's definitely an area it's like kind of like you said, of like you didn't have, you kind of had something you wanted to make a film of, but you didn't have that kind of the idea. And I think, I work with film a lot, even just personally, and I kind of, there is that kind of intimacy to it. But I think you talking about having it on the wall kind of reminded me of kind of Burroughs's writing technique of moving things around. I think, having physicality in the edit style must have been quite interesting. And I guess, did you have a clear, I'm assuming the aesthetic was quite well documented, you kind of knew what it would look like, or did you change it in any way? Because it's almost like you're looking at different magnifications throughout the film at times. Like you can see every kind of prick of the needle. But was that something that you played around with and you had to experiment with, or was it quite clear cut?
No, it wasn't. And I have like I have serious control issues, and I'm a very controlling person, so it's really healthy for me to move from laying this out on the computer to like this mediation to then splicing it and sending it to a lab to scan and seeing it very differently. And it was very humbling to see how much the image changes. I guess what was kind of lovely about that, and you describe it as a kind of microscopic image, or like a kind of like intense zoom, something like I got some feedback that's similar to what you're saying, and they said it's almost like it's vision that can only be facilitated by a lens, like a microscopic lens. But in my case, it's also a film lens. And I really like that description of what this is, which is ultimately this abstraction. And yeah, I played around a little bit with different like ways of resizing the image to fit into the frame, but ultimately, I think at first I was kind of jarred by it, and I was like, is this too much? Is this like too much for the viewer to sit through? Is this going to make someone nauseous? Am I okay with that? But then ultimately, I really liked the abstraction of the dots, and that it sort of moves in and out of abstraction, and sometimes it's very clear, and sometimes it really is just noise. And that is, I guess, more of like a painting language that I didn't really think of myself as engaging with until this film. So that was like a nice discovery where I kind of started thinking, oh, like, what is this doing? This is about surface and color as much as it is about sequence and movement. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think as well, it kind of, would you say that it kind of aligns with structuralist film, or is it kind of different in that way? Or like, how would you define it if you were to put it into a box, which experimental film isn't about, but you know what I mean?
Yes, I think my design, I think as I was wrapping it up, and maybe the second part of the film, this kind of like long sequence without the voiceover, where the music takes over and the color is a lot more pronounced, kind of the color section of the film, whereas the first part is more black and white. Yeah, I think in bringing this film together, I discovered that I am interested in structure, that it is kind of like my desire for the film is that. And now I'm working on a film like that. That is not only that it's more abstract and there is no voiceover, but I'm basing parts of the film on this experiment, on this modernist abstract expressionist painter. So yeah, it kind of like the film kind of, that's nice. That's a very nice comment, Jacob. Thank you. Yeah, I think as I was working on it, the narrative like got resolved, and that was cool. But the thing that got exciting was the structuralist questions of like shape and color and space. And that's where this next project is going to be, which is in production. But yeah, I guess the film kind of ends in that way, doesn't it? In this sort of more abstract.
Well, that was the thing as well. And I think because it's a technique that I hadn't seen before, and I think most people watching it as well, which is probably one of the components that makes it so captivating, is you know, and kind of I'm really into structuralist film and kind of that lineage and the kind of circumnavigating the senses almost. And it is kind of interesting that maybe even subconsciously you started with the narrative, and then it does actually quite seamlessly drift into the more emotive abstract. I think that's probably the part that I really love about the narration, the ending of it, and that it's a really strange feeling. I guess when people watch it, they'll have to know. But I'm intrigued because you kind of answered one of my other questions, which was more about your documentary practice, and I was wondering whether they intertwine or whether they're quite separate, and how maybe going on you'd want to amalgamate the kind of techniques that you've been working on into the film.
Yeah, I think so for the most part, the documentary projects kind of reside in experimental documentary work and more maybe film essay, where the camera's presence, the kind of camera's ability to frame is hopefully for the viewers, like, is at the forefront of what the content of the film is too. And, or at least that's where a lot of my interest in documentary lies, is just like, what does it mean to be present with a camera? Like, what does it mean to have this extension of your body, like, which is this apparatus, this extra eye, and what are the kind of limitations and affordances of that? So I don't know, very classic, like French cinema verite, I guess, of sorts, or one of the inspirations could be called that. But I think, I don't know. I think right now, when I'm talking about her type, or when I like wrote that little description, something I was thinking about was the two earlier shorts that I made. One was like kind of a straight on documentary called Mr. Hutcherson and His Fantastic Cat Menagerie, which was kind of a short interview, little film, like a 12-minute film about this collector of life-scale cat sculptures. And he displays them in his front yard and kind of illuminates them with these LEDs and creates plaques for them. And I was really kind of fascinated by his yard. I don't know if this is a practice in England. I did not grow up with this practice in Russia, but when I came to the United States, I was kind of amazed by like the space that is the front yard in America, where it's this like kind of fantasy space for the pastoral, and it's this thing that faces outside and the public can see, but it's also private. So it's both like public and private. And then yard art sculptures is something I've been thinking about as these, like, they're often of animals, or they're not always, but like, what is the deal with placing a yard sculpture of an animal into your yard? Is this desire to like be in the woods again, like pre-industrial desire, or is it that we've been so alienated from animals that we like, they can only exist as these statues, as these objects? But usually these objects are not huge, like there's something you can pick up and move. If the homeowners association gets mad at you, you can easily move them. But his were enormous, like big cats, like lions, the size of a lion. And they were like all over his yard. And when I was talking to him about it, so many of them were actually not just decorative, but serving as a memorial for his deceased friends and relatives. So I guess it was a documentary, it was a portrait, but the cats themselves were somehow like entering this space between life and death, and between like, memorial and like kitsch decorative object, and filming them or thinking about what it might mean to film them made me think about just some of the earliest histories of cinema where life and death were so close, or like the meditation on life and death was really close, right? Like, this is a very long-winded answer, but I promise it'll make sense. Like, I'm thinking about like Topsy the elephant being electrocuted, right, in 1903, I think. And it's like the first depiction of death on film ever. And it's an animal, which was like always fascinating to see an animal on film. One of the earliest, like other than porn, like earliest fascinations of film is like seeing animals. But what's amazing about a film strip, and this working from film, is you can play it both forwards and backwards. So something I wonder about when I think about that first depiction of death and dying on film is whether it was ever shown to the audience playing backwards, where like Topsy would be resurrected. I bet it was shown that way. So I don't know, I just think about like what it means to give movement to something, or like what were some of the earliest fascinations with film when it was just invented. I mean, it was this like fascination with movement and capturing something, but it's also about seeing this other temporality of sorts. So I guess some of the questions around what fascinates me about filmmaking kind of continue into these new techniques and processes. So it's not exactly answering your question about how direct on film printing might enter a documentary, but maybe more how some of the ideas that find their ways into documentary film and video and experimental video and film and video art kind of continue their life or iterations in this very kind of tactile experimental process. So the kind of overarching questions or the overarching desires maybe are similar, or they overlap maybe. Yeah.
Really? No, yeah, because it kind of, I guess that's the thing. It's an idea I've had in that celluloid is kind of like really free now to, I think there's a Robert Bresson quote in his book Notes on the Cinematograph. It's great, but there's a quote in that that's always stuck with me. It was like, the soundtrack created silence. And I've kind of always viewed that in a certain sense of, you know, like celluloid being just, it's like pulling out your phone, and back in the day that's what it was. It was just the medium of which to capture things. And I feel like now we're in this digital age, there's a really interesting kind of, it's free now to actually embody its own thing. But then I kind of wonder where else it can go, and then that's when I'm asking the questions about the kind of melding it and, you know, using it in different ways, and, you know, like in your work. And it's very interesting, and I guess I'm intrigued about where you think and like why you work with celluloid, or like, you know, and what attracts you to it, and just just general thoughts on it, really.
Yeah, for sure. I think printing on film directly felt like, I mean, film is beautiful. It's just beautiful. Light, like shooting through celluloid, is really, really beautiful. So I don't know. I think I really, but I don't work with celluloid in that way, I guess, yet, or I have in the past, but I not recently, not since, I guess, not in many, many years. So I guess finding this process, I think it is freeing. I think you're right. I think celluloid is freeing now because you can do so much, and because it's not just a medium for capturing movement or whatever, and it could be a self-reflective medium. And I think the other side of that, the dangerous side of that, is because it's so beautiful and seductive, and because it's a medium of light and emulsion and, you know, indexicality and all of that cool stuff. I think the kind of danger of that, or the criticism of that, right, is that like it's hard to make work that's not just about the process, you know? So I think I found the inkjet printing liberating in that way, because it was ultimately not indexical, right? Like, and if indexicality is in many ways about this immediacy of like, here's the referent, I'm capturing it, I'm instilling this moment in amber I'm mummifying this, and it's mine. It's an indexical mark. The thing that I have captured is a stand-in for this actual thing. I was there, the protest, the lover, you know, the tree, whatever it is you want to capture. So I think what's liberating about inkjet printing specifically is that it complicates indexicality quite a bit. It's so mediated. You have to go through the computer in order to print it. You have to go through the digital And I hope, that's my hope for the film, is that the inkjet printing kind of liberates celluloid from the romanticism of filmmaking when there is digital options and they're on everyone's phones. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It
But
feels
that
like
is,
a necessity, I suppose, for you, especially for the film, like a necessity in just like there was no other way that the idea, because I always like my kind of thing is like the idea is everything, like whatever the idea dictates, that's what you do. It's like what will best serve it, and kind of you are in service to the idea, and it seems like that would be, they're just very entwined and quite nicely for you, I suppose.
yeah, I guess it was lucky, I guess, to land on this material, to land on this structure. And that is not at all to say that folks that go and play with 16 millimeter in a dark room or are interested in Dexco, like that is amazing too, like, there's this filmmaker, Sky Hämeenkyrö, who like shoots on 16 millimeter, and they're like, he's very big right now, so whatever, but like his work is like so sincere and so beautiful, and so much of it is just observing how beautiful light is and how like you can only capture it this way in 16 millimeter, right? Or like I recently saw this film by Ute Orand, I think, this German filmmaker, and yeah, like there is this meta quality to the film, but it's also totally seductive in how celluloid can just hold light differently than anything else. So not to like poo-poo indexicality or shooting on celluloid stuff that could be shot digitally, but for me personally and for this film personally, what was liberating is the ability to have this mediation, to have this kind of like material, yeah, like as you said, like a material that it could not be anything else. It had to be printed. It had to go through the inkjet printer, and what can go through the inkjet printer, like celluloid can do it in a way that, I don't know, it go through inkjet printer and capture motion. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so I was going to ask you one more question. It was kind of related to your kind of, I guess, the obsessive nature of the idea through the text and of Un-Tidal, but also it was something that you mentioned with the gentleman with the giant cat sculptures. It seems like maybe there was an affinity towards him because of that obsession, or maybe wanted to try and understand that. And it was kind of wondering about the themes that you deal with overall, and whether there's anything you've noticed, or and just kind of like what you've meditated on in that regard, really.
I love that. Thank you. I do feel an affinity with him, and he sadly passed away last fall. But yeah, I think it's very seductive when someone has a vision, and he kind of had this amazing vision. Yeah, I appreciate that comparison to his project with these projects. And I think so often I will be attracted to an image or an object and not really know why. When I saw his yard sculptures, I had already been kind of, I don't know why I was doing it, but I've been like collecting footage of yard sculptures. It was like a moment in my life when I was moving around a lot, and every time I would move, I would like go around the neighborhood and creepily film people's yard art. And I didn't know why. I just really wanted to capture it, and I guess like indexicality allowed for that like ownership. And it took like, I think about 3 or 4 years to figure out why and what could be made out of it. And another film emerged from it called The Imaginary Kaleidoscope, which is a kind of meditation on yard art, and it's a little bit more experimental than the portrait film I mentioned earlier. But yeah, I think that's kind of the incredible thing about working experimentally, is that you can allow your mind to drift, or your camera lens to drift, if you will. And there is maybe like a collector's fascination to some of the work that I do, or some of the ways that I think maybe other experimental filmmakers work, where often one's drawn to images or whatever, drawn to content, images, objects, texts, and then through this accumulation and through the process of accumulating it, it becomes clear why it's happening, like why you're drawn to these. I mean, there is something metaphysical to it, I suppose. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm working on a film now that I started 2 years ago, and it's all shot through like reflections in streams and rivers. And I don't know, it might take another year or two to finish. And I think that's incredibly liberating, that I can work in that way. There is this really sweet essay by the filmmaker Maya Deren. Do you know her?
Yeah.
You probably know this essay. It's called Amateur versus Professional. And it's like 1 page long. I give it to my students sometimes. And she kind of starts out this essay where she's defending the word amateur. And she's like, amateur has this apologetic tone, but really it comes from the word lover. And that is how we should embrace amateur filmmaking, or she, I guess, uses amateur and experimental interchangeably. And then she just kind of like bashes Hollywood. She's like, look at their enormous machines. Look at all those cords they have to manage. When you've just got one camera, your body is the best tripod. You can move in all these different ways, and your joints are more impressive than any pans and tilts that a tripod can do. And she really just kind of glorifies this ability to work experimentally or as an amateur, because it offers this incredible physical freedom, but also freedom from deadlines, right? Like that's kind of the wonderful thing in not working in commercial cinema, is that things can unfold on their own time. There's almost a kind of like maybe painterly quality to it, right? It's done when it's done.
One person in the photo who wasn't identified was a woman standing behind the group, slightly to the left of Chagall. The image, its black and white grain, was beautiful. She was seized by the desire to possess it. She grabbed the file and impulsively dragged it onto her thumb drive. Copying the digital file was so easy, so effortless, so immediate, that it didn't even register as transgression, let alone theft.